Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all took advantage of the brief break that we had. They had some light refreshments over at the hotel. They had some snacks and a smoothie, which was very nice. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lori Schaffer. I am the moderator in this room for this afternoon, which means I will introduce each speaker in turn. Currently, we have Robert G. Let's emphasize the G. Lee. I've known him for many years. He now lives in the UK, but we are thrilled to have him back on American soil for his presentation. Now, if you are using an FM system, bear in mind that they don't work in both buildings. They are site-specific. You need to pick up a library FM system to use in the library. And when you leave the library, you need to drop it off and pick up a new FM system in the hotel and leave that one there as well. So leave the FM systems where they are, if you please. And currently, our FM devices are out in the hall, just to the left of that entrance back there. All right. Thank you very much, and enjoy Robert G. Lee's presentation.
Thank you. This is mine, so we're all set. Fantastic. This is me, and are there any questions at this time? Thank you very much. Yes, I sweat through the presentation. The title is kind of a long one. The name of the conference is equally long, but my name is fairly short. Although my colleague's name is not as short. He is in the UK, but we just refer to him lovingly as PLJ in sign language, but that is Peter, my colleague. And I'll explain to you the model of interpreting that he and I have been working on for the last 4 years, but before I do that, I do want to give you some background. So Peter and I have worked together for about 6 years now. Peter is an interpreter, a British Sign Language interpreter for many, many years, over 40 years. I'm an American, have 25 years of interpreting experience here. And we started talking about role, and there are a variety of ways to represent that concept in sign language. But we've talked about the problems of role, how we talk about it to hearing consumers, deaf consumers, how we conceptualize that whole concept. So that's really the research question that motivated our work together. And because we have both been involved in interpreting for so many years and have been the beneficiaries of interpreting for many years, we were able to reflect on successful and less successful interactions. And our goal was to develop a model that would reflect successful interpreted interactions. And before we get there, I want to share some theoretical foundations with you. Those of you who saw the keynote this morning actually will hear some repetition in my talk. Maybe it's going to be your job to figure out how, in fact, my ideas and his ideas will go together. But there are studies done in translation, Vermeer, specifically, coming up with the Scopus theory, with the goal of translation. So let's talk about a book in English that is being translated into French. Is it our goal to translate such that people can understand the story, the meaning, or the English text? So you have to know what your goal is before you engage in the work of translation. That's the first underpinning. There's also, of course, a variety of work done in the field of interpreting theory. There's the machine model that we had at some point, then there's the sense of being involved at some point. Wadenscho's work, Roy's work, Metzger's work, Bélanger, just came out in 2004. I guess that's not recent anymore, about 10 years ago. But all of these researchers talk about the co-construction of meaning that happens in an interpreted interaction. Goffman is a name that comes up often in this work. But in fact, Goffman's work built on Linton's work in 1936, sociologist who talked about role. And I will share with you more about what Linton talked about. But we have taken these theoretical frameworks for our underpinning foundation to get at what we mean when we say role. And so translation is a purposeful human action in much the way that interpreting is, but interpreting requires interaction because translators can work by themselves to produce their work. Interpreters cannot. Just as Dr. Jansen said this morning, that the need to understand who you're in conversation with in order to produce a successful interpretation. I know for this audience this is sort of an obvious slide. If we look at the literature, there have been rules that have promulgated, but they are not actually following the rules of communication. And so one of the things that we feel is we have to go back to basic principles. How is language used in communicative encounters? And then apply those principles in our interpreted interactions or interpreting work. And some of these you may already know, but it does bear repeating because it influences our work. So we're talking about some of these basic principles, starting off with Grice, that communication requires cooperation between the interlocutors, and even in a dispute case, but generally speaking, I want to exchange information with somebody else. I want you to understand what I'm saying, and vice versa. So there's a cooperative principle at work. Another work of discourse analysis is done by how the participants align with each other and how they work to co-construct the meaning as communicators, because the goal is to cooperate and to align with each other. And that doesn't matter what language you're using, but in a monolingual interaction, the goal is to align. What also comes up in a communicative encounter is that we accommodate our interlocutor. So if somebody uses a particular vocabulary item, we might incorporate that vocabulary item into our own production so that we are accommodating each other's use of language. And there we see the role again. It's a 4-letter word in my lexicon. Goffman's one of the first people who talked about speakers, meaning people who use language, not necessarily hearing people, but speakers and audience, hearers. It's a little bit complicated, too complicated to go into right now, but we are receiving and sending messages in our communication. So, for example, imagine a politician whose script has been written by somebody else. So the words and the ideas were given, to somebody. And the role then is to bring in that message, somehow enact that message, and then send it out to the audience. And here we go, 1936. Nothing new under the sun. So when he talks about status, it could be your socioeconomic status or your status within a particular community, but you are performing a role. It's not something you have, it's something that you perform or enact. And so we were wondering how that might apply to our work as interpreters. So your status is really, why are you in this room? So person A and person B don't have the same language, so I am in the room because I have both languages at my disposal, and I'm going to facilitate that communication. That's my status in that setting. This is really key to the model that we are suggesting. Often people talk about role as something that you have, like interpreters sometimes say, I'm going to step out of role. You can't actually step out of a role because you are performing a role, you are enacting a role. So imagine a doctor, a deaf patient, and an interpreter in a room. You know, when you say you're stepping out of the role, are you going to become the patient, or are you perhaps going to become the doctor? Is the doctor going to become a patient? There are 3 actors, there are 3 roles, they are the only roles that can be enacted. But if you're saying, oh, I want to, advise something, that's unethical, right? But we often do it as interpreters. So it's something that we do rather than something that we have. It's like, it's a game of, people think it's a game of tag. It isn't. You're performing a role. You might not be an effective interpreter. You might be a very effective interpreter, but that is the behavior. So everything I'm going to be talking about subsequent is dealing with that particular issue. There was a conference last year in Berlin, Germany, and there was a woman who was an interpreter who talked about kind of the hallmark of a very successful interpreter. And as you can see here by the quote, it's somewhere in that gray area between someone who's totally helping and someone who's completely not involved. So there's sort of a continuum along there. So Peter and I started thinking about it. It's not a free-for-all. We can't have no rules. There have to be some constraints and limits on what it is that we do when we're in this position. So we've come up with the concept of role space. When I, as an interpreter, enter that space, I am really entering the space. I mean, sometimes it's physically, you're in the room, you're taking up physical space, but you're also taking up conversational space. So how much do we become active participants, and how much do we try and get out of that space? We've come up with a diagram of axes, which I'll show you now. So the vertical axis refers to interaction management. So, for example, if both participants are speaking at the same time and you control the communication, if you are the communication cop, so to speak, that's a high level of interaction management. If you let them figure it out themselves and take no role at all, that would be a low level of interaction management. So that's the vertical axis. How much do we control that interaction? This horizontal axis refers to participant alignment. And that refers to how much you are accommodating each of the speakers in order to understand what they're saying. So, if you're giving a presentation and you can't see hearing or deaf people, you can't actually align with them if you were on stage and had a bright light. But in other settings, of course, you certainly can. And the third axis you should imagine that this is 3D. Obviously, it isn't 3D on the screen, but the third axis has to do with the presentation of self. So high presentation of self is when you are really obviously there as an interpreter, and low presentation of self is you won't answer questions because you're not in the room. Remember, pretend I'm not here. If you're dating somebody in the room, that might be too high a presentation of self. But there's an axis there's a continuum along that axis. So I have two examples, hopefully, to help you conceptualize this model. The first example would be in something called escort interpreting, when you're with a person, perhaps foreign dignitary. Peter went to China, for example, and traveled all around and had an interpreter assigned to him for, his week. So they were cultural mediators as well as language mediators. So they went out to a restaurant, and the woman would, the waiter would speak in Chinese, and the interpreter would, explain not only what was on the menu, but also give tips such as, if you don't like spicy food, don't get this or that item. So the short-term escort interpreting is an interpreter is someone who is quite involved. The other example I'll share with you is that of medical interpreting. And you can imagine the change that happens from the preliminary appointment, when there's a medical history taken and so forth, and then the ongoing treatment, and how the role of the interpreter role space might be affected by that. So in escort interpreting, you're allied with your one client. You're going to be talking with them a lot, and then there will be interlocutors who come in and out of the picture, and you'll be letting the client know about those interlocutors. So that recent example I shared with you about the Chinese example, if you don't like spicy food, don't order item A. That would be a higher presentation of self, and there might be higher interaction management that happens as an escort interpreter. So that's the role space that is inhabited by an interpreter in this situation. And here's an example of what a preliminary medical history might be. So I, as the interpreter, don't know the doctor or the patient, and I might be, I don't want to say neutral, but objective. I'm not aligned with either, but it's important information, so I might be higher in terms of managing the interaction. But because it's the first time, I don't know either of the people involved. I'm not aligned with either of the people, and I'm not trying to be present, myself as who I am in that room. But over time, that role space may shift as I get to know the participants better. You can see that interaction management is still high on the follow-up appointments, but there may be a little bit more presentation of self, a little bit more participant alignment. Because they have now seen me on subsequent times, the doctor or patient may ask how I'm doing. I might be seen as fully a person present in that interaction. And if we continue to go for treatment or appointments, again, that role space will shift. So it began with a very low presentation of self, and then that presentation of self increases. It began with a very low participant alignment, and then it increases. And again, this is not something the interpreter decides necessarily, but it's a dynamic, fluid situation that is negotiated among the interlocutors. I have 1 minute left? Really? Wow, okay. So in conclusion, what we have done is taken concepts from sociology to inform how we work and discuss this concept. And there are still, I struggle personally with how to sign role. I know in the States people sign it in a particular way. In the UK, it's signed in a different way, sort of similar to how it's signed for person. And I'm not really happy with any of them. So I'll give you a little more homework, which is to figure out how to appropriately convey this concept in your language and in your signed language. And, Peter mentioned what's important. They must know about us. As Terry Jansen said, they have to know what it is that we do and about us. And we have to be able to align with them, ask for clarification, following and meeting certain expectations of communication encounters according to the rules of the two languages that we are mediating. Our job is to make that communication as normal as possible, but there are two cultures and two languages involved. So when I talk about space, I'm talking about the physical space, the mental space, the personal space. And that role space shifts not only appointment to appointment, but even within an interaction. So it's important that you are aware of the space that you're occupying as an interpreter and aware of what the interlocutors want, because that is a negotiation that happens in an ongoing way. Thank you very much, and thank you to the interpreters. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have about 2 minutes remaining for questions, if there are any. Do you mind putting your email address back up on the screen? Thank you. Any burning questions from the audience? I see one. Would you come to the front of the room, please? Do I have to stand on the X? Does X mark the spot? There? Here?
Shall we dance?
Okay, so that's role and space. Anyway, so my question to you relates to role and identity. Do you feel that there is some overlap there, or that they are separate entities?
I did not pay her to ask me that question, but it's another area of interest, which is identity development for interpreters. I think the presentation of self depends on who you are. So often novice interpreters in the UK, they will ask how they should introduce themselves in a setting. And this could be a woman who is 25 years old and British. So I actually have never been a 25-year-old British woman. I just don't have that life experience. I don't actually know how she ought to introduce herself. I am a 40-something, we'll leave that unsaid, year-old American man. And how I introduce myself based on my identity and the expectations of myself in a professional context might differ quite a bit. So I think it's important to mention for those of us who are educators, we talk about something called soft skills, and I actually call them hard skills, in other words, challenging skills. The language stuff you can get, the theory, the processing, that's important, but how we interact with people, how we engage with people, that is equally crucial. And interpreters need to know their identity. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be, performing all aspects of their identity at all time. You have to be appropriate in that particular professional context, but you should know what parts of yourself are appropriate in what kind of situation. That doctors, may all be doctors, but they have different personalities, the same as bartenders or therapists. So it's the same for interpreters. We are individual human beings, but there are expectations that have to be met. That's a kind of a short answer to your question.
Thank you very much. We do have 1 minute remaining, and I see one more question. Please come to the front of the room. You have 60 seconds. Again, okay, hi there. Thank you so much for this great presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. I was having a conversation with the presenter, but you're right. I think this information is becoming more and more relevant these days because deaf people are being hired into organizations and they are getting designated interpreting services. And we are seen as part of the team, and I think this is really an important thing to start thinking about, because it's coming into our jobs more and more these days, about how people view us, how they see us as a team, how I see myself as part of a team, how I negotiate those things, how I give a little and take a little. So thank you very much for bringing this to the forefront.
And I'll just briefly respond to that, if I may. That is important, because in medical interpreting, so I've had the experience of working as a freelance medical interpreter as well as a staff medical interpreter. And what staff people do when you see the other staff every single day, as opposed to when you only come to that setting once in a while, is quite different. So I'm hoping that this model will help people conceptualize. Using those 3 axes will help them make decisions on how to travel along the axes. So thank you very much for that question.
All right, everybody. If you used an FM system here, please do return it to its appropriate place before you leave the building. We have about 5 minutes between now and the next presentation, so feel free to mingle. Thank you.
Anywhere you want. I'm easy.
Well, if I had a nickel for every time I moved.
Oh, nickel. You have a nickel. You want to talk it? Is that good? I'll talk about this route. Okay. Is that bad?
Yeah, that's good. That's
Okay.
good. That's good.
Cool.
There you are.
I need help. I always need help. I want to start with this slide. And that's what my work is on, looking at the perception of identity that hearing people have of deaf professionals that comes as represented by interpreters. So I'm coming from a theoretical basis in linguistic anthropology, and I want to give us some background. Fortunately, we've had both Terry Jansen and Robert Lee, so we can go through this really quick. I'm going to touch these 3 topics on this slide, and we'll go. This morning, Jansen explained that discourse is negotiated, meaning is constructed through negotiation. And in linguistic anthropology, we also see identity as constructed through negotiation. People are interacting with each other, and we construct the idea based on whether the person we're talking to us comes across as genuine and credible. And I think these are really important points for interpreters. These are some theories from linguistic anthropology. I'll quote them verbatim so you can read along with me. Interactional identity construction is beliefs about language and the kinds of people who speak in certain ways that contribute to language use, indexing, pointing to identity, in part an outcome of interactional negotiation, in part a construct of others' perceptions and representations. So what this means is we have a lifetime of experience communicating, and over our lifetime we have built up concepts of what it means to be a person who talks this way or talks that way. And we have this lifetime of experience that we bring to us to every interaction. And so even though two of us are engaging in conversation, it's the recipient's perception that we're interested in looking at. So this is a little picture of what dyadic identity construction looks like. I'm the person on your left. I am presenting myself. I'm presenting who I am through the language I'm using. You are the person on the right, and you have ideas about people who come to Gallaudet and speak English instead of signing. People who come to a conference and speak really quickly and ignore how hard it is for the interpreters. People who ... So you have all these ideas. In addition, you're receiving my information. You're receiving what I'm saying, how I'm saying it, and through your social lenses as well as your ideas and this language are constructing your perception of my identity. But I'm still talking. And so what that means is that your concept of my identity continues to shift over time. And basically that means your construct of the identity of the speaker is progressively negotiated, reified, and refined throughout the interaction. It's not done. It continues. So what do interpreters bring? Interpreters bring their own identities, clearly. They bring ideas about language and interaction. And they bring interpretation skills and ideology. And they bring one more thing. Institutional talk is a concept from Druin heritage that says that professionals who use language to accomplish their task are using institutional talk. So lawyers are using institutional talk. Car salesmen are using institutional talk. Teachers, etc. And in looking at the criteria for institutional talk, interpreted speech satisfies all the criteria, which means that we interpreters are bringing institutional talk, which means we're being seen as experts. And we speak as experts in this interaction that we're interpreting. So from both Terry Jansen and Robert Lee, we've talked about the roles of interpreters. And researchers and practitioners know that interpreters are not just taking language and throwing it at the listener, that we look at the lexical, syntactic, and discourse level and make decisions about how we're going to present it in the target language. So in effect, Melanie Metzger and others have said that we are authoring the target language. Sometimes we're making it up, but most of the time we're trying to go from the source text. However, the people that we're interpreting for don't know our role. They don't have any concept of what it means to be an author as opposed to an originator. And they see us as the expert, and their assumptions of our task is that we present information in a verbatim manner. So we are animating the utterances, like reading off the cue cards. So here are comments that I've received about interpretation from people who are not interpreters. The first comment was an interview I did with non-interpreters in New York who said, "You're supposed to be just saying what they're saying." And I asked even if I said and they said yes. Every everything is coming directly from the deaf person. When I brought this to the American Anthropological Association to discuss how interpreters can affect the perception of identity, professionals of language and interaction said, I realize I had assumptions of the transparency of interpretation. So they thought we were So if even experts think this, what's going on in interpreted interactions? And now I'm just going to go into what happens. I don't have time. I'm going to go straight into my study. In my study, I'm going to read through these two segments. There are assessments of the identity of deaf lecturers through direct communication in ASL, and assessments of the identity of those same deaf lecturers via interpretation. Here's a pictorial. We have deaf docents, which are museum lecturers, museum educators, videotaped on-site in museums in New York City. Each of these lectures was videotaped and then presented to a group of deaf ASL experts who evaluated the deaf docents on the criteria of knowledge of topic, communicative skills, language use, style, were they of museum caliber. The second group of participants received the same deaf docent lectures that had been signed in ASL, but now we had 4 different interpreters watch those docents lecturing, and they interpreted each of those lectures into spoken English. All the interpreters were certified. All were women. All have years of experience ranging from 2 to over 10 years certified. Those interpreted lectures were given to hearing museum educators in museums in New York City who, for their living, evaluate museum lecturers. So they then listened to the lectures and assessed each of those interpreted lectures for knowledge of topic, language use, communicative style, museum caliber, and because they have the capacity to do this, whether or not they would hire them. And both quantitative and qualitative ratings were given. So first I'm going to compare the difference between the deaf raters and the hearing raters. On this slide I'm going to read through. On your left, the deaf raters watching docent 1 said she was very knowledgeable, but a hearing rater said she had only superficial knowledge. Deaf rater said plausible. Hearing rater said really understand what she was talking about. Deaf rater said communication style was appropriate. Hearing rater said this is not focused, descriptive, critical language. Deaf rater said exudes confidence. Hearing rater said lecturer does not have confidence. But we don't want to assume that this is just an artifact of interpretation. So now we want to do a comparison of hearing rater evaluations between interpreters. Same rater, same deaf docent, different interpreters. On your left, for language use, vocabulary use. Via interpreter B, the presenter uses straightforward, clear, and appropriate vocabulary. Via interpreter C, this is not focused, descriptive, critical language. From interpreter B for style, very much like the style, clear and straightforward. From interpreter C for style, the frequent resorting to this type of generalized, non-explanative language is something to be avoided. Same docent, two different interpretations heard a couple of months apart. What was interesting to me was that when all of the hearing raters assessed the knowledge of the deaf docent, it almost didn't make any difference which interpreter they heard. All the ratings were within 1 or 2 points, within 1 point of each other. And I'm going to show you a slide example of one. However, the other attributes of professionalism were different depending on the interpreter they heard. So let me show you an example of one slide. Docent number 2, Museum Rater X. The scale is 1 to 6. Here we have knowledge, either 2 or 3, depending on interpreter. Communicative style, 4 or 3, depending on interpreter. But look at the bottom 3. Use of language for interpreter A, 1 out of 6. Interpreter B, 3. Interpreter B, C, 5. Interpreter D, 4. And notice how closely aligned the museum caliber rating is to the language use that was heard from this interpreter. Also, there is a similar pattern to the scoring of Wood higher. So the attributes of knowledge as part of the professional identity don't seem to be affected by interpreters. But interpreters are giving very different perceptions of the caliber of the docent by the language that the interpreters are using. So the museum evaluators talked about style, they talked about tone, they talked about flow, they talked about several positive things the interpreters did. In addition, there were things that tricked their ears, and that's what I want to focus on in my last few seconds. I noticed 4 domains of miscues that the hearing evaluators responded to in a negative manner. I've labeled them linguistic resources, markers of expertise, discourse choices, and process artifacts. And I'm going to share some qualitative comments from the raters on, first, linguistic resources. So linguistic resources includes knowing museum terminology and specificity of lexical items. These are 2 different things. Knowing museum terminology, I had so many examples of words that interpreters use that were incorrect in museums, and they were noted by the evaluators. But there were also examples of just plain English that the interpreters used, that the museum evaluator said, that's not good English. So the person speaking it doesn't sound as professional. I've also, my favorite is register, and I'm going to read it out loud. The site is a museum, and this person is speaking to museum visitors. She is not in a bar chatting with her friends. Now, that comment only came from one of the interpreters. That comment was not made with other interpreters. So this starts to talk about the impact of interpreting choices on the perception of deaf presenters. A few more comments about presenters saying the language using indicates she doesn't know the material very well. The language use indicates a lack of knowledge of art. The language use says one should probably not be lecturing in a museum. Next, I'm going with markers of expertise. I'm going to read this slide. Fillers are used in communication to signal that there's going to be an impending delay in the speaking. There could be word search, linguistic retrieval markers, whatever you want to call them. But hold on, something more is coming, is what they're saying. The source ASL contained no fillers whatsoever. The ASL evaluators didn't comment on them. I didn't see any when I watched the tapes. However, interpreters authored fillers because they were working really hard. And the assumptions of verbatim interpretation affected the perception of identity when they were heard by the museum evaluators. Here's some examples. So, ums and uhs. Ums and uhs, one rater X said, sometimes nice and fluid, other times too searching in an I'm not sure way. Rater Y said, less confident tone than others, more stuttering, and and ahs, with pauses. In all of the ratings from X and Y, they never once mentioned interpreters. They always talk about the lecturers having these characteristics. However, Rater Z mentioned interpreters when in comments about And she said she assumed the interpreter captured everything, including distracting elements such as She said, again, must have been said by the educator is distracting. And in a third comment, which I think is really important, I will read verbatim. She said, I notice, in many tours of lectures for educators and docents, and it's better not to assume about our audience knowledge base and be as descriptive as possible. So here, 3 things went wrong. 1, she attributed the to the deaf docent and not to the interpreter. 2, she misunderstood what signaled. She thought the docent was actually telling the audience what they already know. And 3, she then assumed that the docent didn't know better and didn't know not to use those kind of terms and had to admonish her and tell her how to be a better docent. Obviously, a professional docent would know such a thing. So the perception of this docent's identity was changed by the insertion of the interpreter-authored fillers. There's inconsistent attribution of speech. Is it coming from the interpreter or is it coming from the originator, the deaf docent? The rater said when she heard an interpreter say something was missing, the rater said, I didn't factor that into my score because it seemed to be related to the interpreter rather than to the lecturer. But on fillers, that same lecturer attributed it to the deaf docent. So this means that our addressees cannot distinguish when we are authoring information that's impeding their assessment or whether it's coming directly from the deaf presenter. So they're mainly attributing these statements to the deaf presenter. 98% of them were attributed to the deaf presenter. And they're utilizing these statements in their assessments of the professionalism, the professional identity of these deaf docents. Really quickly, another area of miscue was when discourse in one language did not match the expectations in the other. For example, constructed discourse is found in all registers in ASL, and it was produced by all 4 docents in this study. And interpreters, we know, have various options, strategies on how to produce that in English. But their choices often followed individual patterns. So interpreter C preferentially chose to make a direct quote, and that gave us this response. So, several findings. One is that hearing recipients of English interpretation rated the deaf educators differently than did deaf recipients. But secondly, and very interestingly, hearing ratings of the competence and professionalism of the deaf docents differed depending on the language use of each interpreter. So, there are several questions and lots of implications, and time is running out. How much reliance do recipients place on interpreters for professional identity? Is there a difference between single versus repeated interpreted encounters? And do interpreter choices affect just register? Do they affect just identity? Do we shift genre? What's going on when we're making these decisions? There's implications for education and mentoring, but time is up, so I will go to conclusions. And it says that the situated identity of an interpreted speaker is mediated by interpretation, according to this pilot study. And recipients' ideologies and expectations contribute to that, as well as interpreters' discourse choices. And here's my contact information. These are all the people I need to thank. Come up and talk to me and ask me questions, and let's flesh this out. Thank you. Oh, no, I thought you did. You don't.